Hi guys, I hope you're doing well. I want to move on to some more curiosities and information about mixing. I described earlier how the frequencies work. Where the low frequencies reside, where the mid lows, mid highs, and finally high frequencies are. So this is one aspect of mixing. So you have to decide which instrument is going into what set of frequencies. The other aspects are, for example, one very important aspect is left and right. We are generally accustomed to a stereophonic way of listening to things. That means we have two sources of sound. So we have a left here and a right here. So this is your right speaker and this is your left speaker. So obviously not all instruments go on right or left. You generally have a separation. Some instruments are both on left and right. This is quite a recent way of mixing. In fact, if we look at some of the old Beatles mixes, they would put, for example, the whole drum kit on right or all the voices on the left. Nowadays, mixing is done in a more naturally sounding way. So in a room, obviously, if you were listening to a band, you wouldn't have a hard right pan on all the drum set. You would hear a bit of both. So mixing today is really about trying to get the best sound out of your instruments. So this is one parameter of mixing. So you have your left and your right, but then you also have depth, and that's something that we don't consider very often. But in a mix, in fact, just like in a room, we would have things that are at the front and things that are at the back. So what does this mean? What means something's at the front or at the back? So generally this is related to the amount of reverb and attack that an instrument has. What does that mean? Let's think of one of the earliest example of mixing when audio platforms and DAWs weren't yet invented. The first real example of mixing is the orchestra. So in an orchestra, what do you have? You have the lead voice. What is the lead voice in an orchestra? The violins. Where are the violins positioned? Right at the front. So just like an orchestra is positioned, you have to position your instruments in a mix. So first you have to understand what purpose they have. So for example, if there's a melodic line that is a leading line, it will probably go at the front of the mix. That is your example of your voice, or in the case of an orchestra, your violins. So obviously the instruments at the front will be more clear. And how will they be more clear? What does more clear mean? It means that they have a more detailed attack. So by attack, I mean the very, very start of a sound is its attack. It's a very, with two coins, it's a very example. This is, for example, a very attacky sound. So if you take two coins, you put them next to your ear, and you do this sound. This is a very, very short decaying sound. That means that it's basically only attack. So it's at the beginning of your words. It's the violin. It's it's your violin first note you know, when the player hits a string. So that is the attack. And obviously, the more clear the attack, the more close to you the attack is, and the more it's defined, the more it will be easy to understand that sound and to picture it in your mind. So sounds at the back. What does sounds at the back mean? So this is where you would have your timpani, you would have your low instruments that keep up, that hold up all the rest of the orchestra. So these sounds normally have a lot more energy in the sense that timpani and double basses, these have a lot more energy than a violin. But they also have, by putting them in the back of the mix, they also have less attack, so they're less detailed. So, by having instruments in the back, you also have more reverb, because generally speaking, in a room, an instrument that is at the back will bounce off the walls. Say these are the walls. It will bounce off the back of it will bounce off the back of the walls a higher number of times than an instrument's at the front. So this is your listener. So let's call this your listener. So okay, so here are your 2 ears. So here's the listener. Okay. So obviously, a sound that is at the front, the sound is right here, will reach directly the listener. If we have a sound that is, say, back here, so this is behind in the mix, it will have to bounce off various walls before it gets to the listener. There might be some direct frequencies arriving to the listener. But they will also have to pass across all the other players. And a lot of what the spectators will hear will be the reflections of this sound. Therefore, a less detailed sound. So let's make some concrete examples on this. So first of all, in your average DAW, how would you put a sound back in a mix? Well, that is quite easy. You add reverb. So to have a sound back in the mix, you would add reverb, and to have a sound in the front of the mix, you would add no reverb at all, possibly have very little reverb. So that means a direct sound, like whispering into someone's ear, direct. So I've got some coins here. Let's try doing an example. So, for example, in your standard mix, in most popular genres, so from R&B to pop to blues to most of your mainstream record music, or any type of popular bass genre that is an experimental would have, for example, so if we have a pop song, where would the voice be? So here's the front of the mix. That means not much reverb, a direct sound, and this is the back. So, for example, if we had a listener, if we had a voice, where would we put in the mix? We would probably put it at the front. So that's one of the things that someone hears most in a mix. So you'd have your voice here. So after the voice, what's just behind the voice? So straight behind the voice, if you pay attention to all the music you listen to, you'll have two sounds. So the two main sounds that are directly behind the voice are, so we have the kick drum right at the back and the bass. Depending on what type of mix, these can flip around. So sometimes you would have say, the kick drum in front and the bass at the back. So you'd have slightly more attack and a detailed kick, and a slightly more flabby bass in the back that still is keeping up all the rest of the instruments. So in any case, you can swap these around, generally speaking. A lot of modern mixings, especially in trap music, have the kick that's at the front. So you'd have the bass behind the kick and a very detailed punchy kick in the front. So now we've organized, so now we have three instruments in our mix. So we have voice, we have kick, and we have bass. So these are all as central as possible in the mix. So sometimes, you know, the bass could be slightly moved, but generally speaking, the low frequencies always go in the center of the mix. A well-balanced mix always has low frequencies in the center. So these, for now, we're only using the back to front axis. We're not using the left and right. So in your mix, do not pan your bass to the right. It will bring out of balance the whole rest of the mix, and everything will seem to be in the wrong place. So you need your bass to be in the back of the mix and in the center. So in the center of the mix, you need the low frequencies. So generally speaking, when you have low frequencies, you want them to be in the center of the mix. Okay, so mid-lows can start to move out more to the side, but low frequencies really have to be in the center of the mix. And I've tried putting the bass here and kick here. I've tried lots of things, but it always comes back to sounding best when you have these two instruments, bass and kick, in the center. So let's add some other instruments. So for now we have voice, we have kick, we have bass. So let's add some instruments. What other instruments could we have in a production? We could have a keyboard, we could have a guitar. So let's put a keyboard in. Let's call this 5P a keyboard. So where would we put the keyboard? The keyboard would probably go just slightly behind the voice, and it would be panned to a side. So depending on what side you would want it to be, we could have, for example, you know, your piano would be probably slightly behind the voice, so with a little bit of reverb, with a little bit of space to it, and pan to one side. So you can decide. It's generally good using headphones for panning, because it's the most obvious way of understanding where an instrument is. So let's put the piano or keyboard to your left, slightly behind the voice. Okay, let's think of another instrument. So again, we could have a guitar, and where would the guitar go? The guitar could go maybe slightly further back. It could be more in the mid-lows, you know. It could be slightly more obscure. And yeah, we wouldn't probably have guitar and piano on the same side, because that would be too much for only one ear. Consider this is the left ear, and this ear here will be listening to this side of the mix. So the guitar would be around here. Let's say around here. Other instruments. So we've only talked about the kick for now, being here, but generally in a mix you also have a snare. So where will the snare go? Snare generally fills up the mid-low frequencies. So where can we put the snare? Let's say this is the snare. So the snare would probably go always in the center, slightly to the side. So now we have a snare here. Generally it's in front of the bass, because the snares are normally quite snappy and clear. And you hear, in most mixes, you hear a very detailed hit on the snare. What else could we add? We could add some of the hi-hats. So, for example, in the drums, you would have some of the hi-hats, and they could be maybe here. So they could be panned to one side, depending on your mix, maybe even quite heavily. So you'd have maybe some of your hi-hats here. And you could maybe have some strings or a pad that was maybe hard panned on one of the sides and you could barely hear it. Or some percussions, for example, a lot of percussions are put on the sides. So if you had, say, a shaker, you maybe want to put it on the side here, or again, lots of mixers have a shaker in the center. Lots of mixers, what do? They separate an instrument in two parts. So for example, okay, so let's just picture this as a rough mix. Going over this again, I'll move on to the next point in a second. So you have your voice here at the front. Here's the listener. So you have right, left. So this is the listener's ears. So right here, we'll hear this side of the mix. Left here, we'll hear this side of the mix. So this is the voice. Most important thing in most mixes. You want it at the front. You want the listener to hear exactly what kind of emotion the artist is portraying. On your left, you want maybe a pad, maybe a guitar, maybe a piano, just slightly behind the voice, keeping the voice up. Because if you think about it, each instrument keeps each other up. So this bass is actually keeping the kick up, and the kick is keeping the snare up, and the bass is keeping up at the same time these two pads, or this keyboard and this guitar. So this keyboard and this guitar are also keeping up the voice. So it's basically a chain reaction of every instrument giving their part in the mix to make it a well-balanced mix and help it become something that is pleasant to the ears and something that lets you hear each instrument but doesn't take away from any other instrument. So again, you would have the voice at the front, you'd have the snare central slightly at the back, then you'd have kick, bass, or the opposite. Quite often it's the opposite. So you would have a kick here and the bass just above it. And here you would have a piano. You could have some percussions here. You could have a synth here. You could have a very, very dreamy reverb that could just give you a slight feeling of what's going on with that synth. So this gives an idea of what two parameters are very important. So you have left and right, back and front. To these parameters, I'd like to add two more things. So obviously, one way also of going back to front is not only through reverb, but is actually through volume as well. So simply by having an instrument louder than another, it will automatically bring this instrument more to the front because it will make it more clear, it will make it more loud and mixed, so it'll be heard more. So just consider that from back to front, you have the one variable that is reverb, and the other variable is volume. So again, you have to find a balance between these two things, and that takes time, and it's something that you really have to practice and understand by listening to lots of music with good headphones and trying to tell which instruments where, how big is the room, try imagining the room the instruments are played in, and try to tell where they are in the mix. You'll find that the voice is normally always at the front. Sometimes you have, most reverbs, for example, just take the low end of the voice. So, for example, you would have the high frequencies of a voice. You'd have the high frequencies of the voice. That would be untouched by the reverb, and therefore making them more clear and more detailed for the audience to perceive them as close. And then you'd have maybe some other parts of the voice that would be under with reverb, so they would occupy maybe spaces in the mix that are around here. So again, there are lots of variables, but the main variables for now are these three. So we have left and right, back to front, and inside the back to front there are two variables. So you have volume and you have volume and you have reverb. So reverb is number of reflections and clearness of the sound before it gets to the listener. So this gives you a rough idea, and this is basically how an orchestra works. So again, you'd have the violins at the front, you'd have the violas slightly at the back, you'd have the flutes closer to the front, because more often